Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on how to tempt the US back into the multilateralism game. My name is Dmitry Grozobinski. I'm the executive director of the Geneva Trade Platform, and I'm here today in a slightly step back capacity to introduce an initiative that really began here at the Graduate Institute where we're based, and is the brainchild of my boss, Professor Richard Baldwin, who joins us on the panel today. He's a professor of international economics here at the Graduate Institute. And with me are two of his fellow co-conspirators in this project, the Tacit Project. Annabelle Gonzalez, a non-resident fellow at Peterson, and Chad Baum, Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at Peterson. And before we go any further, a big congratulations to Chad and Annabelle for Peterson Institute's recent victory, second year in a row as Prospect Magazine's Financial and Economics Think Tank of the Year. Congratulations to you both and to the whole team at Peterson. Now, what are we doing here today? Well, firstly, we are keeping to time. We have 60 minutes and I intend to use them and nothing more, which this close to Christmas, I hope you will appreciate. Really, the discussion we want to have today is to kickstart what we hope to be a global conversation. There are a lot of capitals right now who have spent, I would say, far more than the last 4 years, but especially the last 4 years, watching multilateralism and cooperation internationally hit a rough patch. And there have been a lot of thinking done around what a new US administration could mean for revitalizing that. But at the same time, a lot of the thinking has been very bilateral. There's been a lot of thinking on what the US should do, and a lot of thinking about what individual nation states would like the US to do, but far less on how nations can firstly work together, and secondly, on how they can approach the US administration with initiatives, with approaches, with modalities that firstly align with US priorities and the way the US will look at the world from January next year, but also that won't run into the traditional roadblocks of multilateralism and still achieve so many of those priorities. So that's the conversation we hope to kickstart today. Some housekeeping before we go on. First of all, for the sake of transparency, this session is being recorded and streamed live to YouTube. So if you are going to call me names, make sure they are funny. Secondly, we will hopefully have time for questions. I know there are plenty of you who want to pick the brains of our panelists. If you have a question, please do use the Q&A function of Zoom. It's right there on the bottom bar of your Zoom tab. With no further ado, I might head straight into grilling our panelists. I might start with you, Annabelle, if you don't mind. The Trump administration spent the last, I would say, 4 years making a very passionate case for the benefits of bilateral problem resolution. That if you have an issue with how something's working as a country, especially a country like the United States, the best way to resolve it is bilaterally, whether you through negotiation or pressure. What's the opposing view? What is the elevator pitch for multilateralism with all of its challenges, all of its sort of slowness? What's the counter argument?
Well, thank you very much, Dimitri, and thanks to Richard for bringing me as part of this project. So let me start by saying that at the risk of sounding a bit like one of these holiday cards, I think that the high-level pitch for multilateralism is based on three key ideas. One is peace, the second one is certainty, and the third one is prosperity. In the case of peace, we know the important role that multilateralism plays in settling disputes, and that an organization like the WTO can play in terms of reducing tensions in the system. And we also know too well from history that trade conflicts, if if they don't have a proper channel to be managed, to be sorted out, can escalate into something further. So peace is the first element of the response. The second element relates to certainty. And certainty is very important in the world. It can help, the multilateral system can help stabilize the world economy. It can make policies more predictable, which then means basically that companies, large and small, in advanced and in developing countries, can invest, can create more, can hire more people, can create new jobs. So from the perspective of the growth of the world economy, this element of certainty is very relevant. And the third point that I want to make at this sort of high level is prosperity. Again, there is evidence out there about the importance of trade in helping to sustain growth, the importance of the multilateral trading system in deterring protectionism, the importance of this system, again, underpinning the growth in trade and eradicating poverty, helping to create a middle class, which in countries, which then also opens new opportunities for exporters in other parts of the world. In a more prosperous world, it's also possible to have a better support for the environment and to achieve other important social objectives. So I would say that at a very high level, it's about peace, it's about certainty, it's about prosperity. But then I also want to bring in a very practical element, which is also about self-interest, quite frankly, because we have seen, and the last 4 years, I think, are clear evidence that bilateralism doesn't work. All of these initiatives that were pursued at the bilateral level by the US administration did not necessarily accomplish many of the objectives that they were out there to achieve. So the best way for a country to make sure that other countries behave in the way that it's more convenient to its interest is working in the context of a multilateral framework. So, in addition to the peace, the certainty, and the prosperity, I would add self-interest as a very strong rationale for pursuing a multilateral approach.
Okay, well, Chad, peace, certainty, prosperity, and the fact that everything else doesn't work. That sounds like a pretty compelling pitch to me. Annabelle certainly just then, Annabelle's remarks could have been made perhaps less eloquently by any of Mr. Leithider's predecessors at USTR, the notion that open markets build prosperity. And yet, despite all of that, in sort of recent weeks, every single human being capable of penning an op-ed has written one telling us not to expect the Biden administration to just unilaterally re-embrace multilateralism, not to unilaterally lead the way on opening access to the US market in exchange for the abstract good of the system, and not to move on any of these sort of sensitive hot button issues, whether they're at the WTO or elsewhere. This despite, I think, no one necessarily making the contrary case. So having just heard Annabelle's pitch, what do you think is going to be what's holding the Biden administration back from saying, great, that sounds good, we will resume our role at the helm?
So I think I probably wrote half of those op-eds that you referred to. So yeah, I agree. So first, let me say thanks to you and to Richard and Annabelle and our other co-conspirators on this team as part of this project. It's an honor to be part of it, and I agree that it's incredibly important. I think there's a number of things that are going to be holding back the Biden administration. And so maybe let me lay out a couple of them. The first, obviously, is the two big pressing concerns, maybe three, maybe four big pressing concerns at the moment in the United States are all domestic. So the first, obviously, is the pandemic and public health. We have thousands of people here dying every day, and that is kind of the first order thing that needs to be worried about, sort of our catastrophic public health response and the federal government marshaling resources to deal with that. The second, in addition to that, we have a devastating economic recession that has to be dealt with. And getting the right policies in place to deal with, on the domestic front, both the public health and the domestic political economy to fight the recession are first and foremost the priorities. And then third is just domestic politics. President Trump, he still got 70 million people that voted for him in this election. And he spent the last 4 years, before that, campaigning against trade, campaigning against multilateralism. And then the last 4 years trying to convince, the American public about why it was bad. And I agree completely with Annabelle's assessment that the approach didn't work. But that doesn't mean that there still aren't a huge number of Americans who think differently. And so taking the time and the care to kind of explain what's happening, to educate better about why things need to be different is going to be key. And I think that is going to take time. So that's why I don't think things are going to happen immediately. When the Biden folks, ultimately get there, I think there's other impediments. And that is, we're no longer back in 2016 where we were before Trump. There are a lot of things that he did that are going to need to either be unwound or changed. And we know, as trade analysts, trade economists, that anytime you make a change in trade policy, there's going to be some winners and some losers. So even reversing really bad policies, there are going to be some folks that are negatively affected by that in the United States. And so we have to think through that and think through the sort of complementary policies that we're going to want to have in place to be able to compensate them, to make sure that there isn't too much suffering, even as we get back on a sort of normal path. And then finally, I guess, given where we are, and that there's both so much that kind of needs to be either undone or redone, in addition to a positive agenda, there's a whole lot of thinking through that needs to take place on prioritization and sequencing, and obviously reaching out to like-minded countries and allies to get on the same page. And none of that is going to happen quickly. And so while I, as a trade somebody, wants to jump up and down and say, yes, let's do this immediately right now, our thing is most important, I think we're just going to need to be patient and take baby steps, and if we're going to make any progress at all.
Thank you, Chad. I think we can kind of group the concerns you raised there into two baskets. One of which is the sort of patience basket, which is that certainly some things simply won't be at the top of the in tray, especially during a recession and a global pandemic, and Lord knows what else the Biden administration will have to deal with. But then there are also some longer term structural factors. The convincing voters of the benefits of trade and multilateralism is a decades-long project, not a question of months. So there are some structural impediments there as well. So I guess at this point, I'll kind of throw it to Richard, because I think we've got two pieces of the puzzle here already. We've got Annabelle, who's kind of made a clear case for why multilateralism should happen and why it's important, and also why these bilateral approaches aren't likely to yield the kind of results we want them to. And we've got Chad, who's laid out, I think, a very convincing case for why the Biden administration will be reticent to, in some cases, act quickly, and in some cases, I think, act at all to move in a multilateral direction. As Chad said, 70 million people voted in a way that suggests that they are not fans of multilateralism, and that's not nothing. 70,000 votes in key places, and we're having a very different conversation. Ditto, the effects of COVID will last some time, and the recession potentially longer, and rebuilding those alliances will take some time as well, and potentially run into roadblocks. So where does this initiative come in? What are you hoping to do with it? What were the postulates that drove it? And how have you gone about your work so far?
Okay, so let me start with just the basic pitch, and then I'll talk a little bit about the constraints. So multilateral, I agree with everything that Annabelle said, but I would put two very specific era-defining challenges that the world faces in 2021. And the first is fighting the pandemic. And the second is fighting the global recession, which are the two things Chad mentioned that need to be dealt with domestically. And there is no doubt that most of the fight against both the pandemic and the recession require domestic actions. But some elements of it are multilateral. For example, the pandemic will not be truly crushed anywhere until it's crushed everywhere. If you look at the way they calculate herd immunity and what fraction of the population has to be vaccinated to get there, that assumes a closed, homogeneous population. But if you continually have people from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa, reintroducing infections into rich countries, this pandemic could easily become endemic, which means it'll be with us for a very, very long time. All you have to do is look at a country like New Zealand, who did an excellent domestic job of crushing it, and they continually are reinfected from abroad and having to do all sorts of things. So you cannot really only fight the pandemic at home. We will need to distribute, produce, and pay for billions, literally billions of doses of vaccine in 2021 if we're going to really crush the disease. Moreover, the trade that's necessary in medical supplies and medical products is something that we have to continue cooperating on and making sure at least it works well. So that's on the sort of COVID side. I think there are elements, admitting, as Chad said, it's mostly a domestic issue. There are elements that will require international cooperation, and a lot of that cooperation has fallen down. The second is fighting the domestic recession. And as we saw after the global financial crisis, the world leaders at the time, led in fact by Gordon Brown, realized that falling back into the protectionist instincts of 1920s, 1930s would be devastating for the world. And this shock is much larger, much broader, and much deeper than the 2008 crisis. And yet we have not had a global call to avoid protectionism and create that certainty that Annabelle talked about, that people can invest, they can produce because they will have markets, and that will allow us to come out of the recession more rapidly. So I think there are two very pressing things that we need multilateralism for right now. Let me go off a little bit less immediate, and that is, in my view, a lot of the stumbling of multilateralism that we've seen in the last 3 years was all due to Donald Trump's view of trade, which was deeply ill-informed. He was feckless, impatient, and reckless, willing to do all sorts of deals, but threatening people all the time. He had a deal maker's, a real estate agent's attitude towards trade policy in a world where these things are way more complex. Now that is disappearing from the stage, but it doesn't mean we're going to go back. I agree totally with the way Chad did it. I mean, America has a lot of domestic problems, and they should deal with that first. But the fact that so much of the disruption over the last 3 years, and I would point out that really Trump didn't start doing terrible things, at least de facto, until February 2017, 2018. It took them a while to get going, that once that goes away, we can go back to cooperate on lots of other things. And the last sort of huge thing on the horizon is climate change. And again, most of the policies we need to mitigate and adapt to climate change and environmental damage will be done domestically, but there is definitely a large international element to climate change and environment that we will need multilateral cooperation to reinvigorate. So I think those are lots of reasons for doing it. So where was the idea? The idea was that I think there was a lot of chaotic thinking in the early days that Biden would just flip back to Obama and everything would be an America that leads the world of trade and leads it by thinking about signing trade agreements and liberalizing trade. And that's not what's going to happen. But I saw an opportunity, and I talked with lots of people, and Chad and Annabelle among the very first. It seemed to be an opportunity to knit together Biden's ambition to restore American leadership more broadly in foreign policy and his deep and abiding interest in environment and climate with a trade initiative to get back into multilateralism, so that restoring multilateralism in trade could be one element of it. So who else is on the team? With basically the G7, we have Jonathan Fred, who's a former Canadian ambassador to the WTO, and Tetsui Watanabe in Japan, who is a former director in METI, and Andre Sapir, who is the great guru of trade policy for the last, I don't know how many years, probably 50 years in Brussels, thinking about these things. And we have talked to a lot of people who know well the constraints, the political constraints. And we believe that there is some scope here for revitalizing multilateralism in trade. And the key issue is to get America back in the game. And that's really what it's about, is to get America back in the habit of viewing multilateral cooperation as a win-win, a way of advancing the interest of Americans and others at the same time, to break away from this instinctual rejection and aggressive unilateralism. So I don't even know if I answered any of those questions, but how it's going to evolve, what we really want is to spark a conversation that getting America back into the multilateral game and getting multilateralism working again is not a bilateral initiative. It's going to take a multilateral cooperation of a bunch of countries to make it start making sense again of multilateral cooperation in economic affairs, and everybody realizing that we're all better cooperating than fighting unilaterally. So I'll just stop right there. I don't know if I answered any of the questions you asked, but at least I kind of got out what's driving the initiative.
Well, I mean, the motivations are very important on their own. I guess just the one follow-up I have is, in terms of practically, in case what would you like to see other organizations and others do with this sort of launch? That if you've lit a spark, where does the fire go and what does it look like?
Well, I'll throw it over to some people who know the different trade constraints and policies better than me. But let me just say I would like very much, I think we would like very much, that there's conversations in think tanks and ministries, not just of how can Canada get rid of the remaining protection, or get a foot into the Buy America way, or how can Europe get rid of some tariffs or whatever, to get to think more broadly that this is an opportunity to go at least partway back to a world where cooperation is something that makes sense for everybody, to put the light back in enlightened self-interest, so to speak. And I think that will start with a conversation in think tanks, trade scholars, and then lead over into ministries. What happens after that? I've been at this game a long time, as my colleagues have as well, and I've decided that you never know when you're influential in these things, but you can know whether they listen. And so that's the hope, that they listen, they start discussing the ideas, and start a process which hopefully will switch the mood, which has been very negative over the last 3 years, to something more positive.
Thank you. That was the clarity I was hoping for, Richard. Thank you very much. On that sort of theme of listening, we've started to get questions in, and so I'm going to discard temporarily park the pre-prepared questions I had, because people who are smarter than me have questions, and see what people can see what our panelists can do with them. So I might start with the first one to Annabelle. Annabelle, Costa Rica has been on the forefront of a lot of green and environmental initiatives. I know Costa Rica considers itself to be a leader around climate policy. And we have a question that sort of, I think that ties somewhat to your bailiwick from, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, Derek Stokalpa, asking if the EU Green New Deal could become a platform for the EU to engage the US. And I was wondering if you had any perspectives on that.
So thank you very much, Dimitri. I would say that the climate change and the sustainability agenda more broadly is going to get increased attention in the years to come, among others, because the challenge, is larger by the day. And while trade cannot sort out all of the issues associated, of course, with sustainability, it clearly can make a good contribution to sustainability and to the environment more broadly. So I would say that maybe in this idea of making progress in very concrete steps, while the EU Green Deal is certainly an interesting platform, there are also other initiatives out there that are already well advanced. So I would like to think, for instance, about the negotiations on fisheries subsidies in the WTO, with a very clear mandate from leaders to make progress in that area and to conclude those negotiations. Well, it didn't happen right now, but I am hopeful that this is one key topic for next year. Then there was a negotiation on environmental goods agreement some while ago that was suspended. Maybe it's time to go back into bring that negotiation back. There's now in the WTO, there's been a proposal by several countries to start a conversation on trade and environment and look exactly at what is it that the WTO can do in this realm. So, Richard mentioned that we had three pressing issues for multilateral cooperation at this time. COVID is one, the global recession is another one, and climate change and sustainability is another one. So I would definitely think that it would be good for allies of the US and the US as well, of course, to start thinking about concrete initiatives in the context of the WTO that could be pursued to foster this agenda.
Are there other forums beyond the WTO? I know you've worked with, obviously the World Bank, the OECD. Are there other forums they should be exploring as well?
Well, I do think that the different organizations can bring, a lot of expertise and can tackle the issue of climate change from very different perspectives. I would say, and certainly, the World Bank, OECD, they do great work in this area. I would like to say that in the context of trade, it is certainly the WTO, I think, the best place to look at the trade-related angles of this aspect. Again, not at the whole challenge of sustainability, because it is certainly broader than trade.
Thank you. It's for me, it's really interesting to draw that sort of distinction, because increasingly, as I guess the remit of what is considered trade grows, and you have things like digital taxation that are, do they fit in the OECD? Do they fit in the WTO? It's interesting to hear you say that the WTO is still where you would, if you had to put chips anywhere, the WTO is where you'd focus. I think that's really interesting to probe a little. Chad, I promised you I would try to avoid making you talk about steel and aluminum today, but we've got two questions I think are really for you. The first one is thankfully on something else, but then Martin Bell does have a steel and aluminum question. So the first question is from Michelle Egan, a trade expert. So what in your view would be the prioritization and sequencing on trade, given the domestic context the US is in?
So actually, I can mention steel and aluminum and with Martin's question too. So maybe I'll just read Martin's question, which is kind of the transatlantic tensions on steel and aluminum and Boeing and Airbus and how those things tie together. Because I guess the point that I would make is a lot of this stuff does tie together, and we need to both, when we're thinking about the sequencing, recognize that. And this is it's not necessarily obvious because the last 4 years, the Trump administration, because they weren't necessarily interested in resolving issues, they didn't make the connections for the rest of the world to see how these things related to one another. So let me try to kind of put them together. So they did steel and aluminum tariffs, right? Let's actually just talk about steel. They did steel tariffs. Everybody in the United States does steel tariffs. So this was not new. Right? The Bush administration, when they came in, did steel tariffs. We've had steel anti-dumping for a very, very long time. In fact, so this is one of our politically sensitive sectors, right? It's located in those swing states that politicians are always fighting about. So this is inherently one of our sensitive industries that we kind of have, the rest of the world has to be cognizant of. If you look to the question of the appellate body, right, which the rest of the world desperately, for the most part, wants to have fixed, and the Trump administration had no interest in fixing. What were the key issues there that got the Americans so upset over the years? And the appellate body concerns are not a Trump administration concern. They date back to the Obama administration. Recall the Obama administration held up the appointment of South Korean nominees to the appellate body. The George W. Bush administration, refused to renew the appointment of an American appellate body member for this, basically the issue of the appellate body making decisions that were constraining America's use of trade remedies, anti-dumping, countervailing duties, safeguards, zeroing for anti-dumping, public body for countervailing duties, and unforeseen developments for safeguards. These traditionally used by the steel industry in the United States. So the answer to this is, well, how do you negotiate a fix to the steel problem, right? Which is the United States now doing tariffs in the name of protecting national security, claiming somehow that our European NATO allies are a threat to America's national security. It's not about that, right? This was the Trump administration sending a signal that says, if you don't like us using anti-dumping or safeguards or CBDs, you don't like, through the appellate body, we're both going to take the appellate body away, and then how you like them national security tariffs, right? So the issue is all of these things get wrapped up with each other and kind of need to be resolved. So I think you got to do these things kind of as a package. Whether they should be prioritized, I'm not sure, but I think the rest of the world needs to recognize how they fit together as a package and has to sort of look at them that way. And then, of course, when we're talking about, to Annabelle's point, on both Green Deal and then coordinating with other multilateral institutions. Green Deal, right? Some of the exceptions, the most polluting industries out there are ones like, or carbon intensive industries are ones like steel, potentially aluminum, depending on how it is that you get your energy. So, that's got to be part of the story as well. So you have to think through all of these things. And then other institutions, we've made no progress in dealing with the fundamental underlying problem, right? In those industries, which was global overcapacity. Where does this come back? Well, this is sort of, ultimately getting us to China and state-owned enterprises and the system of subsidies there. But no progress has been made in the last 4 years of dealing with the source of the underlying problem. So if you really want to tackle steel and aluminum as well, how do you do it? Well, you probably need to bring in, the G20 and the OECD and a lot of information and fact-finding and naming and shaming about what the underlying source of the problem is as well. And so I think there is a coordinated role for different international institutions to be involved in this, but it has to be well thought out in sequence. So I told you 17 things, all in different order. There was no sequencing there whatsoever, but I think this is what, hopefully I'll document. Richard will have a final version of our document lay out the sequence of how this should take place. At least I think hopefully that's what we'll start to bring to the table in this exercise.
So I guess the underlying message to tie those 17 things together is that there are multilateral options, but any pitch to the United States about pursuing them has to be made with a really in-depth understanding of the political gravities within the United States that have driven us to where we are, which often have very little to do with multilateralism or anything, but it's about things like where steel plants happen to be in the Rust Belt versus California kind of thing. Is that a fair back of an envelope?
Yeah, I think that's partially it, recognizing it's our own political sensitivities in the United States. Listen, as an economist, it's hard for me to argue that, rest of the world, let off. We should be able to use zeroing or anti-dumping. But in a sense, if that's the price that it takes for the United States to otherwise keep all of its other tariffs relatively low and to have a dispute settlement system that functions and, a relatively more multilateral approach, then maybe zeroing isn't all that bad. And all the papers that I've written over the last 20 years, we should just rip them up.
There is we trade people do sometimes say that trade's not a morality play, right? Doesn't matter what's just or fair. Sometimes it is just a matter of price for access, and that is one way to kind of think about these questions. Is it fair that the US can use zeroing? Maybe not. Is that, as you say, a price? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But It's a way of framing these issues. We've got a question. I'm going to throw this question to Richard, because we got a question from Chambama, if I'm pronouncing that right, who basically asked a question about whether the US-Africa trade relationship, which at the moment under Trump has lent on these bilateral deals, and is actually seen by, according to him, seen as undermining the AFCFTA Pan-Africa Trade Project. Whether that's likely to continue into the future, whether that relationship will be inversed. I mean, we've just seen the UK sign a bilateral trade deal with Kenya, which has implications for the East African community and for the AFCFTA potentially. It's sort of this whole bilateral versus multilateral thing playing out in microcosm on one continent. So what do you think the prospects are?
Well, so the people we talk to who really know about the U.S., Biden administration view of this is I think they think of U.S. policy as not really involving new trade liberalizing agreements. That's not the way they really want to go. Although we did hear arguments that there might be exceptions for the UK-US agreement, partly because it's with a rich high-wage country, and therefore many of the concerns of the kind of working middle class of America, which has not had a good time, don't really come front of mind when you're talking about trade with the UK. And also some people talked about Kenya, but if I was a betting man, I don't think Biden will, in the first half of his administration, put much political capital in pushing through an agreement like that. So my guess is that any new trade agreement coming from America will face a lot of difficulties, and as a consequence, like Obama just treated trade like a four-letter word for the entire first term. Didn't want to hear anything about new trade agreements. My guess is that that's where that's going to go. But it's all a political thing. And in any case, I think it sort of misses the whole idea that really Biden has expressed an interest in taking leadership in the world on multilateral issues, but he doesn't want to liberalize trade. That old idea that trade has to mean removing tariffs or opening markets, especially American markets, that's not what they're thinking about. But there are plenty of other things you could do in leadership. So I think the African FTA is, if I were a betting man, I would say that's a very low priority for the Biden administration.
Interesting. We don't have much time left, and I am bound by my. We have about 20 minutes left, and I'm bound by my pledge to finish on time. But I do, I guess, want to tackle. I don't know if this is the elephant in the room. Chad alluded to it earlier, but it's certainly the cynic in me when I first heard the tacit idea, what you were proposing. The cynic in me said, listen, a US administration is likely to view almost everything, but specifically trade, through the lens of their geostrategic competition with China. And for the sake of my team behind the scenes, we'll start with Annabelle on this one. They're going to view multilateralism especially, which gives any country, including China, the ability to shape and effectively veto outcomes with some skepticism. So does this geostrategic competition, does the well-known pain points, whether they're around state-owned enterprises, agricultural subsidies, what have you, does all of that still leave room for things that multilateralism could usefully do and that its supporters can push for?
So let me say that I think the multilateral forum can be part of the solution for the issues that the US has with China. There may be underlying broader issues beyond trade, and that relate, more to the sort of geostrategic competition that I think are a bit more outside of the multilateral or WTO realm, if you wish. But if you think about some of the concerns with the structural issues that the U.S. has with China, such as industrial subsidies or the role of state-owned enterprises and others, presumably the best forum to address these issues is the WTO. This does not mean, in my view, that you need to have a multilateral agreement with all 164 WTO members negotiating that agreement at the table. Because in reality, the issue of industrial subsidies is an issue that affects a relatively small but important number of countries. So discussing this in a plurilateral setting in the WTO may be the way forward. Likewise, in some of these issues, the concerns can be addressed through an effective dispute settlement mechanism, working with allies on this. And Chad has been making a very strong case on this front. So again, the WTO can provide the U.S. with an important forum, both for developing new rules that are required to address the concerns that the U.S. has with China, but also to sort out some of the disputes. So I would not go ahead and discard it. I think that is a mistake. It's actually sort of sitting one of the most important tools that you have in the toolbox for addressing these issues. I would actually, go back to it and look exactly how can I work with my allies in the context of the WTO to move forward some of these concerns that the U.S. has with China.
Okay, Chad, I might take that and kind of pass it to you. You've just heard Annabelle say the WTO can be a forum where the US can work with like-mindeds to push these issues. She's floated the idea of perhaps doing it plurilaterally or through, that could be an actual plurilateral initiative or a subgroup, something like a DG's green room process, perhaps, which brings those key members together. But again, the cynic in me just says, well, what happens when China says no? Is there room to do anything constructively at the WTO in the face of effectively a Chinese veto in the first instance? And secondly, are there gains to be had outside of these key sort of razor sharp issues?
I think that's the key question. And I guess the way I'm thinking about it is this is, for better or for worse, the WTO's last chance at kind of tackling these issues. We didn't make any progress before Trump came along. The Trump administration did a fantastic job of waking up the world to at least a significant slice of America's concern with these issues involving China. And I think China has now been awakened by that as well. And now we can go back and say, look, we've got a short period of time, and Richard's got us already working before the Biden team has hit the ground to tackle these issues so that, 3-4 years from now, we can say, look, we actually made progress and we fixed some of the underlying concerns. And my fear is that if we don't, that we're going to be back with, something not all, Trump isn't the only populist. Trump isn't the only bilateralist, the only sort of anti-multilateralist, the only anti-WTO voice in American politics. And I think China recognizes that, right? China, I think, is in a very different place now than it has been historically. And so maybe won't simply be looking to veto things. It may want to engage on some of these really hard topics in ways that it hasn't previously. We'll see. I'm certainly not an expert on Chinese domestic politics. And we've seen a number of steps that have been taken. And so I think there's reason to be skeptical, but I think we have to give it a chance, because I fear if we don't, then it's not only that we're going to be back at this point 4 years from now, but things are then going to really spiral after that.
It's interesting how much your remarks about waking up the world really echo the farewell remarks of Ambassador Scheer, the U.S. permanent representative to the WTO, who said exactly that. He said, his one hope was that at the end of his term, there is a greater awareness of U.S. concerns and what the U.S. views as flaws of the system than there was at the commencement of it. And so it's certainly, I don't think necessarily you and Ambassador Scheer or his boss would agree on everything, but it's fascinating that by that metric, he has succeeded in that you judge that there's to be a greater awareness. I think that's interesting in and of itself. I'm going to go to Richard for a final comment on this, kind of where might there be space issues, because obviously you wouldn't be launching an initiative like this and encouraging everyone to launch themselves into pushing for multilateralism if you thought it was ultimately quixotic. But before I do, I would remind everyone we've got about 14 minutes to go. So if you have questions, do drop them into Q&A, into the Q&A box. We will deal with as many of them as we can while still abiding by my pledge to get us all out of here at 6:15 Geneva time. So I will come back to you, Richard, then. What's your cause for optimism? Chad, I think, has made a really strong case for why this is so important to do now. And I think Annabelle's made a case for why it could be the solution. Why do you think it is?
Well, I'm an optimist by construction. Let me put it this way. Right now, the atmosphere is ruined. Trust has been destroyed. We are not fixing the big problems. And as you mentioned, a big elephant in the world right now of trade is the conflict between China and the United States. And we can't start there because, as you've been pointed out several times, the United States, as a political consensus, in a very different place with respect to China, and also so are many other countries around the world. So we can't really start with that one until the Biden administration starts thinking that cooperation on trade and dealing with allies to address the big issues and challenges is a good way to go forward. So that's why I think the first step is to get America back into the game by putting in trade tracks in its foreign policy interest and its climate policy interest, which has Oval Office level attention in the Biden administration. So here we shouldn't be talking about trade and worrying about flanking policies that help with the adjustment of American workers. It's trade that is the flanking policy on America restoring its leadership role in foreign policy and taking an advance in the leadership role in climate. So we're going to look for trade tracks, which will get Obama back in this. And hopefully that will start to create a feeling of trust and restoring a dialogue more generally, where we can start to talk eventually about things like the US-China problems. Now, I'm also optimistic because I'm old enough to have seen other state-owned enterprises causing troubles in the trade system that then got resolved. I'll remind you, in the 1960s and 70s, France was a planned economy with plenty of state-owned enterprises and intervening. The European Economic Community, the Treaty of Rome, has rules about state-owned enterprises because they were worried that state-owned enterprises and subsidies and directions were interrupting or disrupting trade flows in a way that harmed countries who weren't as state-led, different types of capitalism, in essence, having troubles and having to find an interface. And most importantly was Japan. Japan's economic rise in the 60s and 70s was most definitely mediated by state-led efforts. And that caused, back in the 80s and early 90s, enormous problems in the United States, but also elsewhere in the world, that were then dealt with. We found an interface in which these things could be done. So I'm quite optimistic that we will find one eventually with China, because nobody has benefited more from the WTO system and the rules-based multilateral system than China. China is interested in doing this, but under the Trump administration, there was really no room whatsoever for rational discussion, respectful exchanges about setting up interfaces and disciplines, and there was bold assertions. Now, as we've heard, and we all know, and Chad's written, everybody's written things, we're not going back to the old ways of doing things that both in the United States, in both parties, in very important constituents, this omerta, the rule of silence or law of silence that was often happening in American politics because so many large multinationals were doing business in China, that has been broken, and people are talking about things that China has to change in order to fit into this system that's been benefiting them so well. And if there's a country whose leadership is really tuned in and aware of its constraints and of history, it's China. So I believe that if America gets back into the game of multilateral cooperation, it will create an environment in which we can settle these issues, China, US, we've been talking about, but opening the door to settling and cooperating on things that really matter, like climate, for example. And without the WTO, without America back in the game, cooperating in the WTO, we are not going to be able to deal with those things. One thing we saw, for instance, with the Montreal Protocol, that cooperation on climate things involve trade. And the WTO has elements like border tax adjustments, which could allow those. Those are going to be very tricky negotiations. But unless we get the US as a first step back in the mood where international cooperation on trade issues is a good thing, we will never be able to get to those things. So that's the idea here, is Obama has shown he really wants to restore trust in America's leadership. He really wants to show, Biden. I have to, what?
Biden has shown, not
Oh,
Obama.
Biden. Who did I say?
Obama, which I'm sure
Obama.
is a flattering comparison.
Right. But in any case, so but the Biden administration platform and his policy advisors like Blinken have really shown an interest, and they cannot leave trade off because some of the things that Trump did really ruined trust. These national security tariffs, a lot of the bilateralism, the kind of managed trade things, people have to be reversed before we get cooperation on other things that the Biden administration really, really wants to do. So I believe that although Biden would wish that they can move forward in democracy and all in labor and all these other things, they're not going to be able to do it unless they fix some of the damage that was done by the Trump administration. So I think we will be able to get them started on trade as trade tracks in foreign policy and climate. That once the US gets back into the game will make multilateral cooperation more feasible, and then we can address the really big issues in the world.
Well, on that kind of note, I want to give the sort of the final word to you, Annabelle, if I may, and just to pick up on sort of one of the undercurrents of what Richard was discussing there in this tacit concept of trade tracks. I think Richard and I are roughly the same age, but when I started in trade policy, we were sort of told that trade was firewalled from everything, in the sense that trade was trade and the WTO dealt with trade. And if you wanted to do anything else, then your one consideration should be, how do you prevent this from affecting trade in a negative way? I think the underlying concept of this trade tracks idea that you're all working towards is that mode of thinking doesn't work anymore. And in fact, the inverse thinking needs to happen. So I was wondering if there was an area of policy, whether it's climate change, whether it's the recession, whether it's something else, where you see a way that we should be talking about trade's role that perhaps we didn't used to talk about before, or how we should position that.
Well, I think, Dimitri, that probably the most important point is that trade is a very powerful instrument, a very powerful tool to support other important objectives. And at this point in time, I would say that the most important one is to fight the pandemic. This is a point that all of us have made before, Richard was making right now. This is a pressing issue for each and every country in the world. And there's a very important domestic component of it. But there's also a very significant component that is collaboration, that is cooperation among countries. And trade has a very important role to play, to bring the supplies from where they are produced to where they are needed, to make sure that the vaccine gets everywhere. And this involves not only issues about, export bans or export curbs or trade facilitation or movement of essential personnel or transport services or logistics or distribution. I mean, there's a very, very significant trade component. And I think that this is the right time to pursue an initiative that would bring health and trade together in a way that helps us come out of this COVID-19 tragedy and also prepare ourselves better for the future. So, I do think that this is a low-hanging fruit. In this particular case, President Biden has made fighting the pandemic one of the key priorities of his administration. Well, I would say that an initiative on health and trade is really something that he can, take and run with it. I think it will have a lot of support from many countries from across the world. And it's sort of like, starting your engagement with the world on the right foot.
I think that's certainly very optimistic, and I hope something we can all sort of root for. There's certainly room to improve our pandemic response by working collaboratively. And I think the last few months have really demonstrated the truth of exactly what you're saying. So we'll obviously have to see. That's the time we have. I promise to keep to time, and I will. Let me conclude by thanking very much our three panelists, Chad, Annabelle, Richard. Thank you very much for taking the time early in the morning for those of you in the Western Hemisphere, and after close of business for you, Richard. Chad, you don't get a special thanks because you wake up early, as you told me. But thank you all very, very much. I'd like to also thank Michael and Juanita, our events team, for making this all run smoothly, despite the best efforts of all of us to throw in last-minute problems. The Tacit Initiative is just beginning. I believe there's an event in Tokyo tomorrow to continue the conversation, and we hope it'll be the first of many. There's really clearly a space for countries that have long believed that the multilateralism has a role to play, to come together and look at ways that they can follow Chad's advice and follow Annabelle's advice, which is to find trade tracts in line with the way the US thinks about issues and make truly compelling pitches to the Biden administration. Because as Chad says, this might be the last shot multilateralism has, at least in its current format. On behalf of all of us at the Geneva Trade Platform, we thank you for joining us. We invite you to join discussions on our Beyond Trade network, where you can follow up and ask questions and interact with one another. And we wish you a wonderful holiday and a restful break. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.